My name is Jhon, and this is my channel, Plan Tracade, where we revisit the darkest moments in aviation history, moments that changed the way the world looked at air travel forever. Among the tragedies that still echo through time is Air India Flight 182, a Boeing 747 carrying families, students, and travelers across the Atlantic on what should have been a routine journey. Instead, it became the scene of unimaginable horror when a terrorist bombing ripped the aircraft apart in midair, sending 329 souls to their deaths. It remains one of the deadliest acts of aviation terrorism ever recorded. Under the vast sky of 1985, as global aviation had become a symbol of both modern convenience and human progress, there remained shadows of political conflicts and bitter rivalries that reached far beyond borders. Air India Flight 182, a Boeing 747 bound from Canada to India, would become the unwilling victim of one of the most chilling terrorist acts in aviation history. And to understand the magnitude of this event, one must look back to the circumstances, motives, and intricate planning that led to this catastrophe. It was not an accident, nor the result of technical failure, but a calculated and deliberate attack, born from a political struggle that spilled over into the international sphere and claimed hundreds of innocent lives. At the heart of the tragedy lay a movement thousands of miles away from where the plane fell into the Atlantic Ocean. In the early 1980s, tensions in India's Punjab region were escalating, fueled by demands from some Sikh separatist groups for the creation of an independent nation called Khalistan. The situation turned violent, leading to clashes between the Indian government and extremist factions within the Sikh community. These conflicts were not confined to the Indian subcontinent. They spread to diaspora communities across Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Canada, in particular, with its significant Sikh population, became a hotbed of both support and opposition for the Khalistan movement. It was within this environment that a small group of extremists plotted their revenge against the Indian state, choosing to strike in a way that would capture global attention. The primary mastermind behind the Air India Flight 182 bombing was Talwinder Singh Parmar, a figure deeply entrenched in the Khalistani separatist cause. He was not a mere supporter. He was one of the leaders of Baba Khalsa, a militant group that advocated violent means to achieve independence. Parmar, along with his associates, saw an attack against Air India, the national carrier, as both symbolic and devastating. To them, it represented India's pride, its connection to the wider world, and an opportunity to inflict not just physical destruction, but also psychological terror. The idea was not spontaneous. It was carefully nurtured, planned, and executed over months with chilling precision. By 1985, Canadian intelligence services, particularly the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, were already aware of increasing extremist activity within the Sikh community in Canada. There were whispers of potential attacks, plans involving aircraft, and the dangerous ambitions of men like Parmar. Yet despite the warnings, surveillance efforts and intelligence gathering fell short. CSIS even intercepted conversations and monitored meetings, but they underestimated the seriousness of the plots being hatched. In hindsight, it became painfully clear that the system failed to act decisively on the information it possessed. And this failure would come to haunt Canada forever. The planning of the Air India bombing revolved around the use of explosives concealed in checked luggage. The conspirators knew that airport security systems in the 1980s were not as sophisticated as those of later decades. Baggage was not always thoroughly scanned, and the idea of unaccompanied luggage traveling on aircraft was not as strictly monitored as it would be after this disaster. Taking advantage of these loopholes, the terrorists designed a plan where bombs hidden inside suitcases would be placed on connecting flights, eventually finding their way onto international routes operated by Air India. The devices themselves were crafted using timing mechanisms that would ensure detonation while the aircraft was airborne, maximizing destruction and leaving no chance for survival. In Vancouver, Canada, where much of the plot was centered, The extremists began preparing their devices. They acquired the materials, built the bombs, and tested their mechanisms. It was not a reckless act, but one of cold calculation. Every detail was considered, from the timing of flights to the placement of the luggage. The conspirators sought to coordinate multiple explosions to send a stronger message. Their cruelty was not limited to one aircraft alone. Another bomb was placed on a different Air India flight in Japan, and though that device detonated before boarding, it still killed 2 baggage handlers on the ground, showing how expansive and deadly their plan truly was. The motives for this act of terror lay in revenge and symbolism. Only the year before, in June 1984, the Indian government had launched Operation Blue Star, a military action ordered by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to remove armed militants from the Golden Temple in Amritsar, the holiest shrine in Sikhism. The operation resulted in significant casualties, damage to the temple complex, and outrage among Sikhs worldwide. For extremists like Parmar, this was not something to be forgotten or forgiven. They saw the bombing of an Air India plane as a direct response to what they viewed as an unforgivable assault on their faith and their community. In their narrative, the deaths of innocent passengers were collateral damage in their war for independence. In reality, it was an indiscriminate act of mass murder that killed men, women, and children who had nothing to do with the conflict. The network of individuals involved in this plot extended beyond Parmar. Inderjit Singh Rayat, a key figure, played a crucial role in constructing the bombs. Rayat's expertise in electronics allowed him to create the timing mechanisms necessary for the devices to function. He would later become the only person convicted in relation to the bombing, though his sentence and limited accountability sparked outrage among the victims' families. Others provided logistical support, funding, or simply turned a blind eye, allowing the plan to move forward unhindered. Together, they formed a web of complicity that stretched across continents. As the day of the attack approached, the conspirators executed their plan with disturbing simplicity. Suitcases containing the bombs were checked in at Canadian airports, labeled as baggage destined for Air India flights. Airport staff, unaware of the deadly cargo, handled them as routine items. Security checks at the time were inadequate to detect such devices, and so the luggage moved from one airport to another without raising suspicion. The quiet progress of those bags through the system was a chilling testament to how vulnerable air travel was to acts of sabotage. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies remained in the dark about the imminent catastrophe. CSIs had been conducting surveillance on Parmar, recording conversations that hinted at violent intentions. Yet either through misinterpretation, lack of coordination, or sheer negligence, no decisive action was taken to prevent the bombing. Even when warnings were issued to Air India about possible threats, they were not acted upon with urgency. The Canadian government and its agencies, at that moment, failed to connect the dots, and that failure would be forever linked to the loss of 329 lives. The background of the Air India Flight 182 bombing is not just a story about a terrorist act. It is also a story of diaspora politics, intelligence oversights, and the tragic consequences of underestimating extremist ideologies. For the Sikh extremists who planned the attack, the destruction of the Boeing 747 was meant to be a message, an act of defiance against the Indian state. For the rest of the world, it was a stark reminder of how international terrorism could strike even in places far removed from the original conflict. Canada, often seen as a peaceful and safe country, became the staging ground for the worst aviation terrorist attack before 9/11, forever altering its sense of security and responsibility. In unraveling the layers of this background, one sees how the seeds of tragedy were sown in political unrest, fertilized by vengeance, and allowed to grow unchecked through failures in vigilance. The planning was meticulous, the motives were rooted in anger and ideology, and the execution exploited the very weaknesses of a global system that was unprepared for such brutality. The passengers of Air India Flight 182 were unaware of these dark forces at work as they boarded their plane, believing their greatest concerns lay in the long hours of travel ahead. Yet behind the scenes, a deadly plan was already in motion, born of hatred and carried forward by individuals determined to turn their rage into a spectacle of destruction. June 23, 1985, dawned like any other summer morning across Canada, Ireland, and India. Yet for hundreds of families it would forever become the day their lives were shattered. Air India Flight 182, a Boeing 747 named Kanishka, lifted off from Montreal bound for London, with onward connections to Delhi and Bombay. On board were 329 souls, including entire families, children heading to visit relatives, students traveling for their studies, and seasoned travelers who trusted that the flag carrier of their homeland would bring them safely across the Atlantic. What none of them could have imagined was that in the belly of the aircraft lay a ticking bomb, placed there by terrorists far away from the runway, a device set to detonate when the plane was at cruising altitude, beyond the reach of any rescue. The passengers settled into their seats, attendants went about their duties, and the massive jetliner climbed steadily into the sky. At 1,000 feet, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly below. The serenity of that journey, the routine sounds of engines humming and trays being prepared for meals, disguised the deadly countdown hidden in a suitcase in the cargo hold. Just after sunrise, as the aircraft flew off the southern coast of Ireland, the bomb detonated with catastrophic force. The explosion ripped through the fuselage, shattering the pressurized cabin and tearing apart the aircraft in an instant. The mighty Boeing disintegrated, and within seconds, hundreds of lives were extinguished. Those who had drifted into the comfort of sleep, those who were quietly conversing, those who had been sipping coffee, all were swallowed by the chaos of fire, shrapnel, and an unrelenting fall into the cold Atlantic waters. Fishermen along the Irish coast would later recall hearing a thunderous sound high above, not knowing at the time they had borne witness to one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in aviation history. Fragments of the plane rained down, scattering across a wide expanse of ocean. Rescue operations were launched swiftly once it became clear that Air India Flight 182 had disappeared from radar screens, but there was little to rescue. The sea gave up its wreckage reluctantly. Search teams found bodies floating amidst debris, seat cushions, and pieces of the aircraft. Of the 329 people on board, 268 were Canadian citizens, many of Indian descent, while the rest were from India, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Entire families were wiped out. More than 80 children perished. The human toll was staggering. A loss felt not just by relatives but by whole communities across continents. Back on land, news spread with speed and confusion. Relatives waiting in airports for loved ones who were supposed to land in London or Delhi began to sense something was terribly wrong. When the confirmation came that the plane had exploded and no one had survived, grief cascaded like a wave. In Canadian cities like Toronto and Vancouver, where many victims' families lived, shock turned into an unbearable sorrow. Most parents who had sent their children on summer trips were suddenly confronted with the reality that they would never see them again. Weddings turned into funerals, laughter into mourning, futures into voids. In India, too, the tragedy struck deep. Air India was not just an airline, it was a symbol of the nation, and the scale of the loss pierced the country's collective heart. Even as families wept and funerals were held, questions arose quickly. How had this happened? Who could have placed a bomb on a plane filled with innocent civilians? And how had intelligence and security services failed so catastrophically in preventing it? Investigators from Canada, Ireland, and India converged to unravel the sequence of events. The wreckage collected from the ocean bore signs of a midair explosion, and soon the focus shifted to terrorism. Evidence revealed that a suitcase loaded with explosives had been checked in at Vancouver Airport, transferred to connecting flights, and eventually loaded onto Flight 182 without its supposed owner ever boarding. At the same time, another bomb, part of the coordinated attack, exploded at Tokyo's Narita airport as baggage handlers transferred luggage bound for another Air India flight. 2 workers were killed, confirming the scale of the conspiracy. Investigators traced the bomb construction to Canada, where Sikh extremists had orchestrated the plan. Inderjit Singh Rayat, a man with knowledge of electronics, was found to have built the explosive devices. His eventual arrest and trial made him the only person convicted in relation to the bombing, a fact that remains bitterly resented by the victims' families. The suspected mastermind, Talwinder Singh Parmar, escaped conviction during his lifetime and was killed in India years later. Despite widespread suspicion and mountains of intelligence pointing to the involvement of Babar Khalsa, a militant Khalistani separatist group, the prosecutions faltered. Witnesses were intimidated, evidence mishandled, and intelligence agencies mired in controversy. The result was a painful failure of justice. For decades, families carried not only grief but also anger, knowing that the perpetrators of the deadliest act of terrorism in Canadian history were never fully held accountable. The political and diplomatic fallout was enormous. Canada, stunned by the revelation that the bombing had been planned and executed from within its borders, was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about its intelligence failures. The Canadian Security Intelligence Service had been monitoring Parmar and his associates, even recording conversations that hinted at violent intentions, yet they underestimated the seriousness of the threat. Air India had also received warnings of potential danger, but these were treated with insufficient urgency. In the aftermath, Canada promised reforms, but for the grieving families, promises could not undo the past. They wanted answers, accountability, and recognition of their suffering, yet often felt forgotten or marginalized as time passed. For India, the bombing was a painful extension of the violent separatist struggle in Punjab that had already cost thousands of lives. It underscored how far-reaching the conflict had become, capable of striking Indian interests even thousands of miles away. The loss of Air India Flight 182 was not only a national tragedy, but also a reminder of how terrorism transcends borders and targets innocents who have no role in the political battles being fought. In the years following the tragedy, official inquiries were launched to examine what went wrong. The most comprehensive was the Canadian government's inquiry led by Justice Jhon, which concluded in 2010. The report was scathing, describing a cascading series of errors and a culture of complacency within Canada's security and intelligence systems. It stated bluntly that the victims and their families had been treated with indifference, and it was only after decades of pressure that the Canadian government formally apologized for its failures. By then, many parents and spouses of the victims had grown old or passed away, never having seen justice done. For survivors of the victims, the legacy of Flight 182 is carried in memory and advocacy. Families formed organizations to keep the memory of their loved ones alive and to demand recognition. Each year, memorials are held in Canada, India and Ireland, where the wreckage fell. At these ceremonies, names are read aloud, photographs displayed, and stories retold, ensuring that the tragedy is never reduced to just numbers. For the families, those numbers represent sons, daughters, husbands, wives, and children whose lives were cut short in an act of hate. The aftermath also reshaped international aviation security. The realization that unaccompanied baggage could be placed on flights without adequate checks forced airports around the world to change their policies. Security measures were tightened, baggage screening became more thorough, and the concept of passenger bag matching became standard. In many ways, the legacy of Air India Flight 182 can be seen in the layers of airport security that travelers encounter today. The tragedy was an early warning of what terrorism could achieve through aviation, a precursor to the more infamous attacks of September 11, 2001. Despite the decades that have passed, Air India Flight 182 remains etched in the history of aviation and terrorism as an event that changed nations and scarred families forever. It was more than just an attack on a plane. It was an assault on humanity itself, taking the lives of children, parents, students, and grandparents who had no connection to the political motives that fueled their murderers. For the families who continue to mourn, the passage of time does not erase the sound of that explosion over the Atlantic, the images of coffins lined up in rows, or the empty seats at dinner tables that will never again be filled. The story of this tragedy is a reminder of how fragile human life is in the face of hatred and how negligence, oversight, and complacency can magnify the consequences of violence. It is also a reminder of resilience, as the families of the victims, despite the failures of justice, continue to honor their loved ones and demand that the world never forget what was lost. Air India Flight 182 will forever stand as one of the darkest chapters in aviation history, a moment when the sky itself became a graveyard, and the echoes of that day continue to call for justice, remembrance, and the determination to prevent such acts from happening again.